In 1620, the English philosopher Francis Bacon sat down and named the three inventions that, in his words, had changed the entire face and state of the world: printing, gunpowder, and the compass. He believed no empire, no religion, no famous person had exerted greater power over human affairs than these three things. He was right. He was also missing one crucial piece of information. He had no idea where any of them came from. Bacon assumed these were obscure, authorless miracles, inventions without inventors. He never knew that all three had been working tools in China for centuries before Europe ever saw them. The list itself, the famous 4 Great Inventions you may have heard recited in school, wasn't even compiled in China. It was assembled by Western scholars centuries later, almost as an apology. Here's the thing that makes this strange. The 4 invention list isn't wrong. It's just small. Behind paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass stands a production line of ideas: cast iron, paper money, deep drilling, the stirrup, silk, porcelain, each one quietly rearranging the world it touched. Some were guarded like nuclear secrets. Some escaped in hollow walking sticks. One was an accident that happened to people searching for the exact opposite of what they found. This is the story of 10 of them, and the machine that built them. Before we open the list, one question needs answering. Why China? Why did one civilization on one end of Eurasia produce so many of the technologies the rest of the world would later run on? The answer isn't genius. It's structure. Start with geography. China was enormous, fertile, and, for long stretches of its history, unified. While medieval Europe was a patchwork of feuding kingdoms, each speaking a different language and minting different coins, China was, again and again, a single administrative space. A single empire meant single standards. One script, one bureaucracy, one tax system. An idea born in Sichuan could travel 2,000 kilometers to the coast without crossing a hostile border. That sounds mundane. It changed everything. Inventions don't matter because they exist. They matter because they spread. Then there was the state itself. Imperial China ran on an institution unlike anything else in the ancient world. A professional civil service, recruited, at least in theory, by written examination. The exam took days. Most candidates failed. But the system produced something rare. A government staffed by people who read, wrote, recorded, and archived obsessively. When a Han Dynasty official improved a furnace bellows, somebody wrote it down. When a Song Dynasty bureaucrat noticed a magnetized needle pointing slightly off true south, he recorded the deviation, 400 years before any European noticed the same thing. Picture the Song Dynasty capital of Kaifeng, around the year 1050. More than 500,000 people inside the walls. Restaurants open past midnight. Printed books for sale in market stalls. Paper money changing hands. Coal smoke rising from iron foundries on the city's edge. A government office whose entire job was printing currency. To a visitor from 11th century Paris, a town of maybe 20,000, this would not have looked like a foreign country. It would have looked like the future. And one more ingredient, easy to miss: pressure. China's golden ages of invention were rarely peaceful. The crossbow was perfected during the Warring States period, when 7 kingdoms fought for survival. Gunpowder weapons were industrialized under the Song, precisely because the Song were militarily weaker than the nomadic empires pressing on their borders. Paper money was born in Sichuan because the region's currency was literally too heavy to carry. Necessity didn't just mother invention here. It ran the entire household. So that's the machine. Scale, unity, a literate bureaucracy that wrote everything down, and constant, grinding pressure. Now let's watch what it produced. One warning before we start. Several of the dates you're about to hear will be older than you expect. A few will be older than the people credited with the invention. That's not sloppiness. That's one of the most interesting patterns in this entire story, and we'll come back to it. Let's begin with a thread. 1. Silk, the secret that lasted. 3,000 years. Somewhere in Neolithic China, more than 5,000 years ago, somebody looked at a moth caterpillar and saw a textile industry. Chinese legend gives the discovery to Empress Leizu, wife of the mythical Yellow Emperor. who supposedly watched a cocoon drop into her hot tea and unravel into a single, shimmering thread. The legend is almost certainly invented. What it decorates is real. At some point, early Chinese farmers domesticated the silk moth, Bombyx mori, so thoroughly that the species can no longer survive in the wild. The modern domesticated moth is flightless. It is, in a very literal sense, a machine bred by humans to produce one product. And what a product! A single cocoon unwinds into a continuous filament hundreds of meters long, stronger by weight than many metals, light enough to float, and capable of holding dye and colors no wool or linen could match. China understood exactly what it had. Sericulture, the raising of silkworms, became a state secret, and tradition holds that revealing it to foreigners was punishable by death. For centuries, the strategy worked. Romans wore silk without knowing what it was made of. Some Roman writers guessed it grew on trees. The trade route that carried it west became so important that, 2,000 years later, we still name the whole network after this one fabric, the Silk Road. The secret finally broke in the 6th century, and it broke like a spy novel. Around 552, two monks appeared before the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I with a proposal. They knew where silk came from, they knew how it was made, and they were willing to steal it. They traveled east, acquired silkworm eggs. Tradition says they hid them inside hollow bamboo walking canes, and smuggled them across some 4,000 miles back to Constantinople. It may be history's first recorded act of industrial espionage. It ended a monopoly that had lasted longer than most civilizations. But notice the pattern, because it will repeat. An invention, a secret, a wall built around the secret, and eventually someone climbing the wall. 2. Cast iron, the state as a factory. Here's a fact that rearranges the standard timeline of technology. China was casting iron, melting it fully liquid and pouring it into molds by around the 6th to 5th century BC. Europe could not reliably do the same thing until roughly the 14th century AD. That is a head start measured not in decades, but in well over 1,000 years. The trick was heat. Iron melts at temperatures ancient furnaces struggled to reach, which is why European smiths spent the Middle Ages hammering spongy, semi-solid blooms of wrought iron. Chinese furnace builders solved the problem with better clay, better furnace design, and above all, better airflow. In AD 31, a Han Dynasty administrator named Du Shu connected furnace bellows to a water wheel, using a river to breathe for the furnace. Mechanized, water-powered metallurgy in the 1st century. And then the state did something very Chinese with it. It nationalized the whole industry. In 117 BC, Emperor Wu declared iron and salt state monopolies. By AD 2, the empire ran 48 regional iron offices, each administering industrial-scale foundries. Archaeologists have excavated around 30 of them. These were not village smithies, they were factories, 2,000 years before the word existed. The output flooded into daily life: cast iron plows, hoes, cookware, axles. Cheap iron tools meant deeper plowing, meant bigger harvests, meant more people. It's not glamorous. No one writes poems about plow blades. But if you're looking for the invention that quietly fed the largest population on Earth for 2 millennia, this is a serious candidate. Most accounts stop here. But the more interesting question is what all that cheap iron made possible next. Because the next invention on our list is essentially a hole. A very, very deep hole. 3. Deep drilling. The oil industry's great-grandfather. Sichuan is a fertile basin ringed by mountains, hundreds of kilometers from the sea, which presented its people with an ancient, unglamorous life-or-death problem. No salt. Salt wasn't seasoning. It was how you preserved food, paid taxes, and stayed alive. And Sichuan's salt was there, dissolved in brine aquifers, locked deep underground. The first recorded salt well in Sichuan was dug roughly 2,250 years ago. Around 2,000 years ago, Sichuanese drillers made a conceptual leap that sounds simple and absolutely wasn't. Instead of digging wells with shovels, they began pounding them open, dropping a heavy iron bit on a cable, again and again, smashing through rock a few centimeters at a time. Percussion drilling. By the 3rd century AD, wells reached 140 meters. Around 1050, drillers swapped rigid bamboo drill pipe for light, flexible bamboo cable, and depths kept falling away beneath them. And in 1835, still using bamboo, wooden derricks, and muscle, the Shenhai well at Zigong passed 1,000 meters, reaching 1,001 meters exactly, a kilometer underground without a single engine. The deepest wells in the United States at the time reached about half that. But here's the detail that stops people cold. Drilling for brine, the Sichuanese kept hitting something else: invisible, foul-smelling, flammable. Natural gas. Instead of fleeing it, they piped it. Through sealed bamboo pipelines, sometimes running for kilometers, straight to the boiling houses, where gas flames evaporated the brine into salt. An integrated drilling, pipeline, and natural gas industry, complete with written contracts and shift work. As late as the 1950s, over 90 kilometers of bamboo pipeline were still in operation around Zigong. When European and American engineers developed modern oil drilling in the 19th century, the percussion technique they refined was, in its bones, the Sichuan method. Every oil derrick on Earth has a wooden ancestor in a salt field in southwest China. Remember the machine we described? Bureaucracy, scale, pressure? You've now seen it forge iron and drill through a kilometer of rock. Next, watch it do something far more delicate. Watch it learn to hold a thought. 4. Paper. The invention. With 2 birthdays. Open almost any textbook and you'll find the same sentence. Paper was invented in AD 105 by Kai Lun, a eunuch official at the Han imperial court. The date is precise. The man is real. The story is documented in the official dynastic history. There's just one complication. We have paper that's older than Kai Lun. In 1986, archaeologists excavating tombs at Fangmatan in Gansu province found a fragment of hemp paper resting on the chest of a corpse, part of a map buried in the early 2nd century BC. That's roughly 2 centuries before Kai Lun was born. Other fragments have surfaced at Dunhuang, dated to 65 BC, and at the Yumen Pass, dated to 8 BC. So was the textbook lying? Not exactly. The records don't explain the gap. They just show that it exists. The most likely resolution, and the one most historians settle on, is that coarse hemp paper had been knocking around China for generations, used for wrapping, padding, the occasional map, and what Kai Lun did in 105 was systematize it. He standardized the recipe, added tree bark, rags, and old fishing nets to the pulp, and presented the result to the emperor as a writing material cheap enough to replace bamboo and silk. He didn't invent paper, he turned it into an industry. In the history of technology, that second step is often the one that matters. To feel why, picture what paper replaced. Books in early China were written on bamboo strips bound with cord, and a single book could weigh as much as a person. There's a Han-era idiom, sui fu wu che, learning of 5 carts, describing a scholar so well-read his library needed 5 wagons. That wasn't a metaphor. That was logistics. Paper made the written word light. Then it made it cheap. From China, the craft traveled to Korea and Japan, reached the Islamic world by the 8th century, and crawled into Europe via Spain and Italy, more than 1,000 years after Kai Lun's memorial to the throne. 1,000 years. Hold on to that number. It's about to become a theme. He made writing cheap. Nobody had ever done that before. 5. The stirrup. 2 loops of metal. That built knights. Now for the smallest invention on this list. It has no moving parts. A child can draw it. It's a loop you put your foot in. And a respectable school of historians has argued it helped create European feudalism. For most of ancient history, riding a horse in battle was an athletic feat. With no foot support, a rider gripped with his knees. Every sword swing, every lance thrust risked tipping him into the dirt. Cavalry existed, but it was a specialist's art, which is partly why ancient armies from Greece to early China were built around infantry. The fix appeared, of all places, on a small ceramic tomb figurine. The clearest early example comes from a Western Jin tomb near Changsha, dated to AD 302, a single stirrup, hanging on one side of the horse too short for riding, used just for mounting. A figurine reported near Nanjing in 2025 may push the earliest known depiction back a few decades further, but the broad picture is unchanged. Within a few decades, Chinese writers had paired them, one on each side, full length. The earliest physically surviving examples of known date come from the tomb of Feng Sufu, a northern aristocrat who died in 415. Mulberry wood cores sheathed in gilded bronze. Stirrups were in common use across China by the 5th century. Think about what the loop actually does. It welds rider and horse into a single mechanical unit. A man standing in stirrups can absorb the shock of a lance hitting a target at full gallop, meaning the horse's mass, not the man's arm, delivers the blow. The stirrup migrated west across the steppe with nomadic peoples, reaching Europe by the 7th or 8th century. What Europe eventually built on top of it was the armored knight, and around the knight, an entire social order of land grants, vassalage, and mounted aristocracy. Historians still argue ferociously about how direct that causal chain really is. The strong version, Lynn White's famous stirrup thesis, has taken heavy fire for decades, and we won't pretend the debate is settled. But the narrow fact stands on its own. The riding technology under every medieval European knight was invented in 4th century China. On paper, a footloop shouldn't outrank an empire. Here's why it did. Empires fall. Techniques don't. 6. Porcelain, the 1,000-year trade secret. Silk's secret lasted 3,000 years but escaped in a walking stick. China's other great material secret held out even against scientists for about 1,000 years of sustained European effort. Porcelain looks simple. It's clay, but it's a specific clay. Kaolin, named after Gaoling, the hill near the city of Jingdezhen where it was mined, blended with powdered stone and fired at temperatures so high the mixture partially turns to glass. The result rings like a bell when struck, glows faintly when held to the light, and weighs almost nothing. Europeans, encountering it through trade, could see it, hold it, eat off it, smash it and inspect the pieces, and still could not figure out how it was made. They called it white gold. They priced it accordingly. Jingdezhen, the city at the heart of production, became something remarkable, a single industry metropolis of kilns, fueled for nearly 1,000 years by the clay deposits around it, exporting by the shipload to Asia, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe. Whole categories of European aristocratic life, the tea service, the dinner set, the cabinet of curiosities, were built around a material no one in Europe could produce. The siege finally broke in Saxony, and the story is almost too good. Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony, had imprisoned a young alchemist named Johann Friedrich Bottger, who had rashly claimed he could make gold. He couldn't. Rather than let him hang, Augustus redirected him. Forget gold. Crack porcelain. Working under the scientist Ehrenfried Walter von Schirnhaus, and effectively under house arrest, Bottger ran years of systematic scorching kiln experiments until, in 1708 to 1709, the team produced true white, hard-paste porcelain. The key was the same insight Chinese potters had reached centuries earlier. Kaolin-type clay, plus crushed rock, plus extraordinary heat. The Meissen factory opened in 1710, Europe's first. It had taken Europe a millennium to catch up to a cup. And notice what finally cracked the secret. Not a lucky accident, but a prisoner, a budget, and years of recorded, repeatable experiments. The siege of porcelain was one of the places where Europe rehearsed something that would matter enormously later. Keep that thought. It returns at the end of this video. 7. Printing, the book that was free before copyright existed. In 1900, a Taoist priest named Wang Yuanlu, clearing drifted sand from a cave shrine near Dunhuang, on the edge of the Gobi Desert, uncovered a sealed wall, and behind it a hidden library. Some 40,000 scrolls, locked away around the year 1000 and untouched since. Among them was a scroll of yellow-dyed paper, about 5 meters long, carrying a Buddhist text called the Diamond Sutra. At the end of the scroll, a line of text, what publishers now call a colophon, records the circumstances of its creation. Translated, it says the scroll was commissioned by a man named Wang Ji on behalf of his parents for universal free distribution on a date corresponding to May 11th, 868. Read that again. The world's oldest surviving dated printed book carries a date, a donor's name, and an explicit declaration that it was free to copy. And the printing itself is the real headline. The Diamond Sutra is not a crude experiment. The carved woodblock images are confident, dense, polished, clearly the product of a mature industry, not a first attempt. By 868, China had been block printing for generations: calendars, dictionaries, almanacs, children's primers. Printing in China wasn't a revolution announced with trumpets, it was infrastructure. Then, in the 1040s came the second leap. A commoner, Shen Kuo, the scholar who recorded his work, pointedly calls him a man of unofficial position. Named Bi Sheng worked out movable type. Individual characters cut in sticky clay, baked hard, arranged in an iron frame, fixed in place with a warmed bed of resin and wax, printed, then broken apart and rearranged for the next page. 400 years before Gutenberg, the complete concept of movable type existed, worked, and was documented in detail. So here's the uncomfortable question, the one historians genuinely chew on. If China had movable type in the 1040s, why does everyone remember Gutenberg? Part of the answer, the one historians tend to reach for first, is writing itself. An alphabet needs a few dozen characters. Literary Chinese needs thousands. From there, it's reasonable to infer the rest. For Chinese printers, carving one woodblock per page was often simply more practical than managing a warehouse of thousands of individual characters. So movable type stayed a clever sideline rather than the main road. Same invention, different writing system, completely different outcome. It's one of the cleanest demonstrations in all of history that technology never acts alone. It acts on the world it lands in. Hold that idea, because the next invention is what happens when a technology lands on a world that was searching for something else entirely. 8. Gunpowder, the immortality drug that kills. The Chinese name for gunpowder is huoyao. It translates roughly as fire medicine. That's not poetic license. It's a fossil of the invention's origin. The discovery wasn't made by weapons engineers. The surviving evidence points instead to Taoist alchemists, and to a goal that could not have been further from war, the elixir of immortality. For centuries, Chinese alchemists had heated, mixed, and swallowed combinations of minerals in pursuit of eternal life, with results that ranged from useless to fatal. Several emperors are believed to have died from their own immortality elixirs. Somewhere in this long, hazardous research program, probably in the 9th century during the Tang dynasty, someone combined saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, and the search for endless life produced the most efficient killing agent yet discovered. A 9th century Taoist text already warns alchemists about mixtures of exactly these ingredients that had burned hands, faces, and entire houses. The discovery stayed Chinese for a remarkably long time, and the paper trail is unusually crisp. By 1044, a Song military encyclopedia, the Wujing Zongyao, recorded the world's earliest surviving written gunpowder formulas. 3 of them for poison smoke balls, exploding bombs hurled by catapult, and incendiary projectiles. The Song state, pressed hard by powerful northern neighbors, industrialized the technology: fire lances, bombs, rockets, and eventually true guns. Then the Mongols conquered most of Eurasia, and the formula traveled with them, reaching the Islamic world and Europe in the 13th century. Europe took the recipe and ran. Within 2 centuries, cannon were cracking open castle walls, and the feudal logic of the armored knight, the one the Stirrup had helped build, was being demolished by another Chinese invention. One export created the European knight. A later export deleted him. History rarely ties its own bows this neatly. And through it all, the name never changed. Fire medicine. The deadliest substance of the medieval world is still labeled in Chinese as a failed attempt to live forever. 9. The compass. The needle that pointed the wrong way first. The compass was not invented to find the way. It was invented to ask the universe questions. The earliest Chinese direction finders trace back to the Han Dynasty, and we know them largely the way the Han themselves recorded them, in writing. A first-century work, Wang Chong's Lun Heng, describes a device shaped like a ladle, carved from lodestone, naturally magnetic iron ore, that, set spinning on a smooth bronze board, came to rest with its handle pointing south. The famous spoon-on-a-plate object you'll see in museum cases is a modern reconstruction built from that description. No Han original has ever been excavated, which tells you how much of this story rests on the texts rather than the artifacts. This device, the Sainan, or South Governor, belonged to diviners and geomancers, not sailors. It told you which way to orient a house, a tomb, a ritual. For roughly 1,000 years, China possessed the central fact of magnetism, and, as far as the records show, used it mainly to talk to fate. The slow conversion from oracle to instrument is captured, step by step, in those same records. The Wujing Zongyao of 1044, the same military encyclopedia that recorded gunpowder, describes a south-pointing fish, a magnetized leaf of metal floated in a bowl of water, for finding direction on land. Then, in 1088, the polymath Shen Kuo, the same man who preserved Bi Sheng's movable type for history, described needles magnetized by rubbing against lodestone, floated on water or hung from a single silk thread. And he added an observation of genuinely startling precision. The needle, he noted, does not point exactly south. It deviates slightly. Magnetic declination, recorded in writing, 4 centuries before European navigators documented the same thing. The final step appears between 1111 and 1117, in a book of anecdotes called Pingzhou Keitan, written by Zhu Yu, whose father had administered the great port of Guangzhou. Describing ocean pilots, he writes that they steer by the stars at night, by the sun in daytime, and when the weather goes dark, they look at the south-pointing needle. That single sentence is the earliest clear record, anywhere on Earth, of a compass used to navigate at sea. Within a century, the needle was in Mediterranean hands. And in European hands, the compass did something China never chose to do with it at scale. It pushed across open oceans to continents Europe hadn't known existed. The instrument that began as a fortune-teller's spoon ended up redrawing the map of the entire planet. We've covered 9. The 10th is the strangest of them all, because the 10th invention isn't really an object, it's a belief. 10. Paper money. Printing. Trust. Sichuan, early 11th century. The province runs on iron coins, and iron coins are a logistical nightmare. 1,000 of the large ones weighed around 25 caddies, roughly 15 kilograms, and buying a single bolt of silk could require dozens of caddies of metal. Imagine paying for fabric with a sack of iron heavy enough to strain your back. Merchants weren't carrying money. They were hauling it. So Chengdu's merchants did something that, in hindsight, looks like one of the most radical ideas in human history. They began leaving the coins in deposit houses and trading the paper receipts instead. The receipts were called jiaozi. 16 of the city's wealthiest merchant houses standardized them, printed them with seals and multiple colors of ink to defeat counterfeiters, and circulated them as money. Then some of those merchant houses noticed they could print more receipts than they had coins, and several of them collapsed. Possibly the world's first bank failures triggered by possibly the world's first overissued banknotes. The Song government stepped in, shut down the private notes, set up a state bureau in Chengdu to manage the system, and in 1024 issued the first official jiaozi, the world's first government paper currency. Stop and feel how strange this is. Every previous currency in world history had been a thing: metal, shell, salt, valuable in itself. A jiaozi note was a printed promise. Its value rested entirely on the belief that the issuer would honor it. Paper money is trust, made circular. It works because everyone believes it works. The Song had effectively invented a technology for mass-producing confidence. Notice, too, that this invention couldn't have existed alone. It required paper, printing, and a literate bureaucracy, 3 earlier products of the same machine stacked on top of each other. and the song promptly discovered the dark twin of that technology. When military spending exploded, the government printed more notes than it could back. The notes inflated. Successive Chinese dynasties reinvented paper currency, overprinted it, and watched it collapse, a cycle the Yuan and Ming would repeat. When Marco Polo described Chinese paper money to Europeans in the late 13th century, readers found it almost unbelievable. Europe wouldn't risk its own state-backed banknotes for another 4 centuries. Every banknote in your wallet, every number in your banking app, runs on the Chengdu idea. That value can be a printed, now digital, promise. So does every inflation crisis. The 11th century gave us both as a matched set. 10 inventions. Now the question that has haunted historians for nearly a century. Look at the dates again. Cast iron, more than 1,000 years before Europe. Drilled wells, deeper than anything in the West until the modern era. Printing, centuries ahead. Movable type, 400 years before Gutenberg. The compass at sea, a century or more before the Mediterranean. Paper money, 400 years before Europe dared try. By any reasonable scoreboard, in the year 1100, Song Dynasty China was the most technologically advanced society on the planet, and it wasn't close. And yet, the Industrial Revolution did not happen in Kaifeng. It happened in Manchester. The ships that forced open China's ports in the 1840s ran on coal, cannon, and compasses. Technologies whose ancestors were all, in some form, Chinese. Within living memory of Bacon's famous list, the inventor civilization was being defeated by its own inventions, reflected back at it. Why? How does the civilization that built the machine lose the race the machine started? This is called the Needham Question, after Joseph Needham, the Cambridge biochemist who spent half a century documenting Chinese scientific achievement in his colossal series Science and Civilization in China, and who placed this puzzle at the center of it. Historians have proposed answers for decades, and it's only fair to tell you straight, there is no consensus. We don't know, not with certainty. What the records show is a set of suspects. Suspect 1, the state. The same centralized bureaucracy that spread inventions could also smother them. Chinese innovation flowed through the government, the iron monopoly, the Jiaozi office, the imperial workshops. When the court was curious, technology bloomed. When the court turned inward, as the Ming famously did with ocean voyaging in the 15th century, entire fields of capability were simply switched off. Europe's fragmentation, its great weakness, meant no one could switch anything off. An idea banned in one kingdom sailed to the next. Suspect 2, the exam. The civil service examination made China literate and administratively brilliant, but it tested classical texts, not mechanics. The most ambitious minds of every generation spent their lives mastering poetry and precedent. Shen Kuo, arguably the finest scientific observer of his millennium, wrote his Dreampool essays in retirement as miscellaneous jottings. Notice the title. Not a system, not a school, essays. Suspect 3. And this one is the most unsettling. Success. China's inventions worked. Cast iron fed the population. The canals moved the grain. The system was so productive for so long that there was no desperate existential need to gamble on transforming it. Some economists call this a high-level equilibrium trap. The machine ran too well to be rebuilt. We don't know which suspect did it, or whether they did it together. But here's why the question matters far beyond history class. It means invention is not destiny. A society can discover nearly everything and still not be the one that cashes the check. What gets invented matters less than what a civilization is structurally able to do with it. That's the real lesson of this list. And it's also, strangely, the most hopeful part of the story. Because the same logic that explains the falling behind explains the catching up. Which brings us to what these 10 things became. Run an inventory of an ordinary morning. You wake and check the time. Susong's astronomical clock tower of 1092, with its escapement mechanism, stands in the deep ancestry of mechanical timekeeping. You handle money that is pure printed or digital trust. Chengdu, 1024. The news you read arrives on paper or on a screen that replaced paper, carrying text composed in movable types descendants. Kailun, Bisheng, the anonymous carvers of Dunhuang. Your breakfast was cooked in a steel pan. Cast metallurgy with a Chinese childhood, possibly over natural gas. And industry Sichuan brine drillers were running on bamboo 2,000 years ago. The GPS in your phone answers the same question Zhuyu's pilots asked of their dark weather needle. If you wear silk, you wear the oldest industrial secret on Earth. The inventory is the point. These 10 things didn't leave monuments. They left infrastructure. They dissolved into ordinary life so completely that we stopped seeing them. Some legacies are words. China is what much of the world simply calls fine ceramic dishware, a country's name permanently fused to a product the way no other nation's is. Kaolin, in every geology textbook, still carries the name of a hill near Jingdezhen. The Silk Road names a fabric's escape route. Gunpowder's Chinese name still files it under medicine. Some legacies are scars. Gunpowder's path needs no narration. Paper money's dark twin, inflation by overprinting, has been faithfully reproduced by governments on every continent for 1,000 years. The song discovered both the tool and the temptation, and every successor state has rediscovered the temptation on its own. And one legacy is an argument. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as China endured invasion and humiliation, the four great inventions list, remember, a framework assembled in the West, popularized by Needham in the 1950s, was embraced in China itself as proof of what the civilization had been and could be again. A list of old technologies became a modern political resource, evidence, recited by schoolchildren, that the gap with the West was a historical episode rather than a natural order. Today, when Chinese officials talk about semiconductors, space programs, or artificial intelligence, the four great inventions are rarely far from the speech. The inventions changed the world once as objects. They're still changing it now, as a story. Here's the thing that makes this strange. Of everything on our list, the longest-lasting invention may turn out to be the list itself. So, back to Francis Bacon, in 1620, marveling at three inventions whose origins he admitted were obscure and inglorious. He thought he was praising anonymous miracles. He was actually reading the export catalog of a single civilization, one that had filed the patents, so to speak, centuries earlier, and then watched the world build on them. But the deepest twist in this story isn't that China invented these things first. It's that being first wasn't enough, and that nobody at the time could have known it. The alchemists who mixed fire medicine, the merchants who printed trust in Chengdu, the drillers who chased brine a kilometer down. None of them were trying to change the world. They were trying to live forever, carry less iron, and make salt. The world changed anyway, in directions none of them chose, on continents none of them ever saw. 10 inventions. One machine that built them, and one question, the Needham Question, that still has no settled answer. So here's where we genuinely like your judgment. Some historians say China's centralized state was the secret of its inventiveness. Others say that same state is exactly what strangled the next step. Where do you stand? Was the empire the engine or the brake? Make your case in the comments. The best arguments from the last video shaped this one. And if walking through 1,000 years of history one ink-drawn stickman at a time is your kind of thing, Chinese History Explained will be here drawing the next one. The needle, by the way, still doesn't point exactly south. Shen Kuo would want you to know that.